It's the end of a decade, 10 years of great music, and some not so great, but let's focus on the positive. What albums were the best of the best? Get ready to count down my picks for the top 10 albums of the decade. That's coming up next on Track by Track. Hey everybody, my name is Kyle and this is Track by Track, music reviews, news, and commentary. Thanks for tuning in today, and if this is your first time here, please take a second to click subscribe so that you won't miss future reviews and more. Decades are an interesting thing when it comes to music, and pop culture in general, I suppose, but in music specifically, it's interesting how when you name a decade, people immediately associate it with certain artists, certain songs, or certain genres. If we want to talk about 70s music, it may be classic rock, or maybe disco. In the 80s, there was new wave, hair metal, and the beginnings of rap. In the 90s, of course, seemed to have become synonymous with grunge music. As we crossed into the new millennium, it feels to me like things got a bit more ambiguous. I'm not sure that the first decade of this century, from 2000 to 2009, could be defined any more succinctly than the one that just ended. I think that with the rise of the internet, MP3s, YouTube, and unlimited music streaming on our mobile phones, the musical landscape has become more diverse than ever. We're no longer limited to our local radio station or MTV as the primary influencers on our musical taste. Today, musical discovery is easier than ever and infinitely more overwhelming. Looking back at the past decade of music and compiling my top 10, I have to say that one of the things I was most happy to see was just how important musical discovery turned out to be for me. When people ask me who my favorite artists are, I inevitably list off older acts, legacy acts, acts that have been putting out music for many, many years. So what struck me about my decade list was how it was actually dominated by newer music. Several albums on this list were debut albums, and a couple others were just second albums by the selected artist. And it isn't as if those legacy acts didn't release anything in the past decade. My favorite band of all time is Pink Floyd, but the simple truth is their 2014 album, The Endless River, was not one of the best albums of the decade. You hear me talk a lot about Nine Inch Nails on this channel, but you won't find any of their music from the past 10 years on my list either. Well, hearing all that, I've either piqued your interest or I've turned you off entirely. But hey, as I said with my top 10 of the year list recently, any countdown like this is really all about personal taste. I may call this list the top 10 best albums of the decade, but it would be more accurate to say that they're my 10 personal favorites. These are the 10 albums that most resonated with me over the past 10 years. The albums I still find myself returning to over and over again. These are the albums that have stayed with me, stood the test of time, so to speak. And let me tell you, picking just 10 was no small task. I'll talk more about that later in the video, but for now, let's dive in, shall we? Kicking off the list of my favorite albums of the past decade is the oldest album on my list, and that's Tiger Suit by KT Tunstall. Now, this may seem like a bit of a head-scratcher for some. After all, there were no hit songs off this album, and I'm not even sure that you'd see it on any other best of the decade lists. But as I look back on the music of the past 10 years and consider what albums I found myself returning to the most, this one easily makes the cut. I've talked about Tiger Suit before in my Great 28 series, so this certainly isn't the first time that I've sung its praises. I really love the production on this album that so perfectly blends the organic acoustic guitar sounds with the pulsing electronic synth loops and sampled vocals. You can feel Tunstall's passion in the music, yet it never feels at all pretentious. The album features a song cycle that feels akin to hits from her Eye to the Telescope album without ever feeling like she's trying to recreate those moments. And most importantly, it's an album I'm still drawn to today. The music still feels fresh a decade on as it did when it was first released. Next on my list is the first of two albums from 2013 that were both on constant repeat for me, not just that year, but with great regularity ever since. The Bones of What You Believe was the outstanding debut album from CHVRCHES. Here was an album that heralded the arrival of an exciting new band, blending danceable, retro alternative synth music with the captivating lead vocals of Scottish singer Lauren Mayberry. This album has an energy and urgency to it that instantly grabs the listener and pulls them in. And as a matter of fact, I'd speak almost as highly of their 2015 follow-up, Every Open Eye, on which the band confidently avoided the sophomore slump with a brilliant second album. consider it a strong runner-up for this list. At number 8 is the second of the two 2013 albums that I could not get enough of, and that's Days Are Gone by Los Angeles sister act Haim. I love every track on this album, from the opening song, Falling, with its irresistible rhythmic shuffle and vocal interplay, to the Fleetwood Mac-esque The Wire, to the bizarrely experimental My Song 5, which may actually be my favorite song on the album. Now, to be fair, I think the Haim sisters let the modest success of this album go to their heads a bit too much, and neither their 2017 follow-up nor the handful of singles since have come close to living up to the promise of their debut. Still, Days Are Gone is a great effort by any measure, and with a new album expected in 2020, I'll remain cautiously optimistic. Coming in at number 7 is an entry that is as much a pop culture phenomenon as it is a hit album. When you think about it, Hamilton truly was a remarkable achievement. After all, for the vast majority of fans, the 2015 Broadway cast recording was their only exposure to the music. Seeing the actual stage show in New York City would be out of reach for most, and it would be another year or two before the show found its way to Chicago and London, as well as a national tour. So, the fact that a Broadway show could so captivate fans based almost exclusively on the strength of its music is saying a lot. And I totally get it. I caught the buzz on Hamilton early on and was blown away by what I heard. I finally saw the Chicago production in 2018 and I was not disappointed. It's a stunning achievement in music and theater, and one that demands a spot on my best of the decade list. We're up to number 6 on the list, and this entry comes from the very beginning of the decade. Body Talk by Robyn was originally released as a pair of EPs back in mid-2010. When the full-length version was finally released late that year, it combined the best tracks from those two EPs and added a handful of new tracks to round it out. The end result was easily one of the best true pop albums of this decade, if not any decade. Obviously, Dancing on My Own was a big hit, and Call Your Girlfriend also made a strong chart impact. But the truth of the matter is, you could have released almost every song from this album, and it could have been a hit on its own. Well, maybe in years past anyway. Times have changed, and the kind of music that dominates the pop charts now is decidedly more R&B flavored. If Body Talk had come out a decade earlier, it might have turned into one of the biggest albums of all time. Still, ranking as one of the best of the decade is a noteworthy accomplishment. As we turn the corner into the top 5, we reach an artist that I've been advocating strongly for recently, based on his excellent 2019 album. But it's Gallant's stunning 2016 debut album, Ology, that remains his most powerful musical statement so far. As I've said before, I am clearly not an avid R&B music buff, but the best artists transcend genre. On Ology, Gallant brilliantly blends elements of R&B, trip-hop, shoegazer synth soundscapes, and even folk to create a sonic soundscape like no other. Oh, and by the way, he's an incredible vocalist. There's some truly jaw-dropping moments on this album that are as breathtaking to listen to today as they were the first time I heard them. And yet it feels like Gallant is one of music's best-kept secrets. How he's not a household name yet, I don't know. Please, check this guy out. 2015 was the year of Courtney Barnett. Well, it was for me anyway. No other album seemed to find itself on constant repeat the way her debut album did. Sometimes I sit and think, and sometimes I just sit, is full of cheeky observations and storytelling that call to mind, dare I say, Bob Dylan. There's so many interesting characters and scenes on this album that I'd be hard-pressed to pick a favorite. But what Barnett truly excels at is celebrating the profound in the mundane. Her lyrics are full of keen details of daily minutiae that would so often go unnoticed, yet shimmer with abstract beauty in her alt-folk rock anthems. That's all part of what makes this album my number 4 choice for the best of the decade, but also makes Courtney Barnett one of my favorite new artists of the past 10 years as well. And number 3 on my list is an album that somehow feels older than it is. How can it be that we've only been listening to Ceremonials by Florence and the Machine since 2011? And indeed, the album is a brilliant follow-up to the 2009 debut, Lungs, which I'd rank quite high on the previous decade's best of list. But when I say that this album feels older, I think what I really mean to say is that it feels timeless. There's something so unique about the sound of Florence and the Machine, particularly on the first 2 albums, that the music feels disconnected from any specific era. The tone effortlessly shifts from ethereal to epic, often within the span of a single song, with soaring vocals and instrumentation so intertwined that they become almost otherworldly. And indeed, there is nothing else in the world that sounds like Florence and the Machine. Well, I have to say, this past decade has been a pretty good one for sophomore albums. I've talked about a couple excellent second albums already, and the album that comes in second on my list may be the best of all the number twos, if that makes any sense. Anyway, I could have easily found a home for Lorde's 2013 debut album Pure Heroine on my list, but her 2017 follow-up Melodrama is the one that truly exemplified the art of the album. Yes, her debut was outstanding, heralding the arrival of a truly exciting new artist, but it was 2017's Melodrama that showed Lorde was not a fluke. Her debut could well have been lightning in a bottle, but it was this second effort that showed that she understood how to harness that energy into a cohesive musical statement. Now, obviously, Uber producer Jack Antonoff deserves a lot of credit here as well. His fingerprints are all over this album. As for album 3, we may or may not see something in 2020. We know work is underway, but Lorde has been taking time off to mourn the death of her dog. It's true. So, condolences to Lorde. Now, before I announce my pick for my number one album of the decade, I have to say narrowing 10 years of great music down to just 10 albums is a pretty challenging task. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run down a list of 10 more great albums, one from each year of the past decade, that I think also deserve honorable mention. Take a look. Alright, we're finally up to the number one album, so let's recap the list so far. At number 10, we started it all with Tiger Suit by KT Tunstall. At number 9, it's CHVRCHES' debut album, The Bones of What You Believe. Number 8 is another debut, Days Are Gone, from Haim. At number 7, the Broadway cast recording from Hamilton. Number 6 is Body Talk from Robyn. At number 5, it's Ology by Gallant. Courtney Barnett's Sometimes I Sit and Think and Sometimes I Just Sit comes in at number 4. Ceremonials by Florence and the Machine is at number 3, and Melodrama by Lorde lands at number 2. Okay, topping my list of my favorite albums of the decade is yet another artist that delivered multiple great albums, not only during the past 10 years, but during the decade before that as well. I picked his 2017 album, Salutations, as my best of the year 2 years ago. But for the best of the decade, I'm going with Conor Oberst's 2014 effort, Upside Down Mountain. Like many of the albums on this list, Upside Down Mountain was the best release of the year when it came out, and it still stands up strong today. Conor Oberst is one of the most gifted songwriters of this era, and that is clearly evident on this album. So many of the songs are filled with brilliant storytelling and scene setting, and for my money, there's no one else out there that can quite so cleverly turn a phrase like him. On top of that, Oberst has a keen grasp on melody as well, always perfectly in service of the lyric. That's evident from the album opener, Time Forgot, with its shimmering, otherworldly guitars, or on the Americana-tinged You Are Your Mother's Child, with its nostalgically folksy guitar. Conor Oberst has built up an incredibly strong discography, if only as a solo artist. Add in his Bright Eyes albums and his indie supergroup Monsters of Folk, and his body of work becomes all the more impressive. Upside Down Mountain by Conor Oberst, my pick for the best album of the decade. So there you go, 10 years of music, 10 great albums, 10 more honorable mentions. What a decade it has been. Of course, as is always the case, any top 10 list really comes down to personal opinion, and this one is just mine. I'm sure there were some surprises here, as well as a few selections that regular viewers would have easily predicted. But now it's time for your lists. What are your favorite albums or artists of the decade? And as we head into the 2020s, what acts do you think will have the biggest impact on the musical landscape in the years ahead? Let me know what you think down in the comments section below. Once again, my name's Kyle, and this has been Track by Track. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. Plus, be sure to check out some of these other videos below that I think you might also enjoy. And of course, be sure to click subscribe, because true music fans always want new releases the day they come out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.